In Oakwood Heights, a teen entrepreneur was about to face the wrath of a homeowners association member who mistook suspicion for authority. What started as a routine summer job spiraled when Karen Whitley, a newly elected HOA vice president, called the police on Marcus Johnson for suspicious activity while he was mowing his own front lawn. Marcus Johnson wasn't your typical high school kid. For 3 summers, he had built a thriving lawn care business, known for meticulous work, professional service, and an ambition that rivaled homeowners twice his age. He had mapped out every property, optimized his routes, and earned a reputation for reliability. When Karen took it upon herself to report him as a potential trespasser, she had no idea she was messing with a young entrepreneur backed by an entire neighborhood who had enough of her safety concerns. Marcus's composed but strategic response would set off a neighborhood reckoning Karen never saw coming. What began as a petty power trip would become a public reckoning. The residents of Oakwood Heights would never forget the day Karen Whitley's attempt to police the neighborhood backfired spectacularly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The June sun gleamed off the edge of Marcus Johnson's newly purchased Toro self-propelled mower, its crimson finish still unblemished and showroom perfect. Sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, Marcus traced his finger along the laminated map of Oakwood Heights, the colored pins marking current clients, prospective customers, and the most efficient route between houses. 3 years in this neighborhood had taught him its rhythms and patterns, which homeowners left for work earliest, which properties required extra attention around ornamental bushes, and which clients paid promptly versus those who needed gentle reminders. "That's looking professional," Diane Johnson said, leaning against his doorframe with a mug of coffee cradled between her palms. Her silk blouse and pencil skirt were already on, though she wouldn't leave for her law office downtown for another hour. "How many houses are you up to now?" Marcus tapped a yellow pin. 12 confirmed with 3 maybes. And look. He pulled a sleek binder from beside him, flipping it open to reveal meticulously organized spreadsheets. "I've got my operating costs, revenue projections, and savings targets all mapped out. If I hit my goals, I'll have enough for first-year tuition at Georgia Tech by the time I graduate." Diane's eyes softened as she studied her son. At 15, he already carried himself with the purpose of someone twice his age, his shoulders square and determined beneath his gray t-shirt. She'd caught glimpses of her late father in his focused expression, the same methodical approach to solving problems. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Then, because she had to, she added, "Let's go over the safety protocols one more time." Marcus sighed. "Mom, we've been through this. Humor me." He straightened, reciting with practiced patience. "I'll text you the addresses before I arrive at each house. I'll wear my branded shirt so people can identify my business. I'll keep my school ID in my pocket. I'll be polite but not overly familiar with neighbors I don't know well. I'll avoid confrontations and call you immediately if anyone questions my presence." What remained unspoken between them was why a 15-year-old entrepreneur needed such elaborate safety measures in the first place. Why Marcus, unlike the Peterson's son down the street who ran a haphazard dog-walking service, required protocols more suited to a security operation than a summer business. "Good," Diane said, pushing away from the doorframe. "I've got court at 10, but I should be home by 6. We can celebrate your first official day of summer break with takeout from that Thai place you like." Marcus nodded, already returning to his map, sliding pins into new locations with careful consideration. At precisely 7 p.m., Karen Whitley checked her reflection in the rearview mirror of her white Lexus SUV, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her linen blazer. The divorce had aged her more than she cared to admit, etching fine lines around her eyes that her expensive skincare routine couldn't quite erase. She'd selected the blazer carefully, professional enough to command respect at her first official CHOA board meeting, but not so formal as to seem like she was trying too hard. Trying too hard had been Richard's parting accusation after 15 years of marriage. "Christ, Karen, not everything needs to be perfect," he'd said while packing. His clothes, It's exhausting living with someone who treats life like a competition nobody else knows they're in. Karen pushed the memory away and gathered her leather portfolio with the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association logo embossed on its cover. Inside were her meticulously prepared notes on neighborhood improvement initiatives, carefully worded to sound collaborative rather than demanding. The HOA vice presidency might not be the career she'd envisioned for herself back when she was Coldwell Banker's top producing agent, but it was a position of influence, a foothold to rebuilding. The community center's meeting room was already half full when she arrived, the usual suspects in their usual seats. Walter Prescott, the perennially bow-tied HOA president whose family had lived in Oakwood Heights since its founding, held court near the refreshment table. Nancy Keller, the treasurer who tracked HOA dues with the vigilance of a tax auditor, was arranging her financial reports in precise stacks. Karen greeted each board member by name, her smile calibrated to friendly but not desperate as she took her seat at the front table. "Let's call this meeting to order," Walter began once everyone was seated. "First, I'd like to welcome our newly elected Vice President, Karen Whitley. I'm sure many of you know Karen from her tireless work on the Beautification Committee." Karen acknowledged the smattering of applause with a modest nod, as if community service rather than desperate need for structure after her life's collapse had driven her involvement. The meeting progressed through standard reports, landscaping, contracts, pool maintenance updates, upcoming 4th of July parade planning, until Walter reached the agenda item labeled Community Security Concerns. "We've received several reports from residents about increased foot traffic in the neighborhood," Walter said, adjusting his glasses. Unfamiliar individuals observed walking through the community, some apparently soliciting or looking at properties. Karen straightened in her chair. This was an opening for one of her prepared initiatives. "If I may," she interjected, sliding a document toward Walter. "I've drafted a proposal for enhancing neighborhood safety standards. It includes more stringent enforcement of our existing solicitation policies, a refreshed neighborhood watch program, and potentially increased security patrols during summer months when we typically see more outside traffic." Margaret Chen, the secretary and one of the newer board members, frowned slightly. "Are we talking about actual security concerns or just people we don't recognize? Because those aren't the same thing." "Of course they're not," Karen replied smoothly. "But prevention is always preferable to reaction, isn't it? Many residents have expressed concern about maintaining the character and safety that drew them to Oakwood Heights in the first place. My son was stopped by a neighbor last month while jogging," Margaret countered. "They asked what he was doing in the neighborhood. He's lived here for 2 years. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room before Walter cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should form a committee to study the issue more thoroughly before making recommendations. Karen, would you be willing to chair that effort?" "Absolutely," Karen agreed, making a note in her planner. A committee chairmanship was a small victory, one she could build upon. "I'd be happy to lead that initiative." The conversation moved on, but Karen noted which board members had nodded in agreement with her proposal and which had exchanged glances at Margaret's comment. Information to file away for future reference. In a neighborhood association, as in real estate, knowledge of alliances was currency. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across George Harrington's immaculate lawn as Marcus climbed the steps to the colonial-style front porch. At 82, George was one of the original homeowners in Oakwood Heights. His property a showcase of traditional landscaping with precisely trimmed boxwoods and heritage roses his late wife had planted decades earlier. Marcus straightened, his shoulders before ringing the doorbell, conscious of the crisp polo shirt with Johnson Lawn Services embroidered on the chest, a 16th birthday gift from his mother that had cost more than he'd wanted to know. George opened the door with the cautious deliberation of someone whose knees protested sudden movements. His eyes, still sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows, assessed Marcus with undisguised scrutiny. "You're the Johnson boy," he stated rather, then asked. "From the Blue House on Maple?" "Yes, sir, Marcus Johnson. I'm following up on your call about lawn service." Marcus kept his tone professionally neutral, neither too familiar nor too deferential. Another skill his mother had coached, the narrow tightrope of being both approachable and businesslike that black entrepreneurs walked. George harumphed. Hartman's landscaping has gotten unreliable. Third time they've missed my appointment. Their father was never late a day in 30 years of service. He gestured for Marcus to follow him around the side of the house. I need weekly mowing, edging, and bush trimming. Nothing fancy, just reliable. As they walked the property, Marcus made notes on his tablet, calculating square footage and time estimates. I can offer you a weekly service package at $45 per visit, sir. That includes mowing, edging, and blowing the clippings from your walkways. Bush trimming would be an additional service on a bi-weekly schedule if you'd prefer. George studied him with narrowed eyes. You're charging less than Hartman's. Introductory rate for new clients, Marcus explained. I'm building my business reputation. A hint of something that might have been approval flickered across George's weathered face. Well, at least you've got a plan. Not like these kids who show up with their daddy's mower expecting $20 to hack at your lawn. You start Monday. We'll see how it goes. Marcus extended his hand. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Harrington. I'll make sure you're satisfied with the service. George shook his hand briefly, his grip still surprisingly firm. Just do the job right, that's all. And tell your mother I said hello. I see her jogging some mornings. Always waves, very polite lady. As Marcus walked back home, inputting the new client details into his scheduling app, a white Lexus SUV slowed beside him. The window lowered, and a blonde woman in sunglasses regarded him with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hello. There, she called. Are you looking for someone in the neighborhood? Marcus stopped, shifting his tablet to his left hand and standing straighter. No, ma'am, I run a lawn service. He gestured to his logo. Just signed a new client. The woman, Karen Whitley, though Marcus didn't know her name yet, studied him for a moment longer, her gaze moving from his face to his tablet and back. I see. Well, have a nice day. The window hummed closed and the SUV accelerated smoothly away. Marcus watched it disappear around a corner before continuing his walk, the encounter briefly disrupting the satisfying mental calculations of his growing business. And 3 new clients today, including prickly old Mr. Harrington, brought his total to 15 confirmed houses. At his projected rates, he was ahead of schedule for his summer earnings goals. He couldn't know that the white Lexus had stopped at the next corner, its driver watching him in her rearview mirror. A new notification being typed into the Neighborhood Watch app about unfamiliar solicitors in the area. Nor could he see Karen Whitley's frown as she tried to place why the teenager looked vaguely familiar, then dismissed the thought as she drove on, her mind already turning to the next item on her meticulously planned day. The invisible lines that divided Oakwood Heights weren't marked on any of Marcus's carefully annotated maps. But as summer began in earnest, those boundaries would become impossible to ignore. Thursday arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Oakwood Heights like a physical weight. By 3 in the afternoon, the temperature had climbed to 97 degrees, the humidity making the air feel thick and resistant. Marcus Johnson had planned his schedule specifically to avoid the worst of the day's heat, finishing his client properties by noon and saving his family's lawn for late afternoon, when the towering oak trees in their yard provided some relief from the sun. The rhythmic hum of the mower provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts as he navigated between garden beds his mother had meticulously planted with native Georgia perennials. His first week of summer business had exceeded projections. 2 more clients had signed on after seeing his work at the Harringtons, bringing his total to 17 properties. At this rate, he'd need to consider hiring help by July. Marcus reached the edge of the front yard and made a careful turn, aligning the mower for another pass. His earbuds pumped Kendrick Lamar into his consciousness, the music creating a private soundtrack to the otherwise mundane task. The precision of his lines across the lawn wasn't just professional pride, it was meditation, a space where the world's complications temporarily receded. 15 minutes earlier, Karen Whitley had sat ramrod straight in an uncomfortable chair, outside the hiring manager's office at Pinnacle Realty Group, mentally rehearsing her answers to likely interview questions. After 3 years away from the industry, this mid-level marketing coordinator position was hardly what she'd once aimed for. but at least it was a path back into real estate. "Ms. Whitley?" The receptionist's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mr. Daniels will see you now." The interview lasted exactly 22 minutes, 10 minutes shorter than the standard 30-minute slot they'd scheduled. Karen recognized the signs immediately: the lack of follow-up questions, the absence of discussion about next steps, the hiring manager's repeated glances at his watch. "We'll be in touch," Mr. Daniels said, already standing to usher her out. "We have several qualified candidates to consider." Karen maintained her professional smile as she gathered her portfolio. "I appreciate the opportunity. I think my experience in the Oakwood Heights market would be particularly valuable, given your new development plans in that area." "Yes, well, as I mentioned, we're looking for someone with recent experience in digital marketing specifically." His emphasis on recent landed like a slap. The industry has changed considerably in the past few years. The subtext was clear. At 45, with a 3-year gap in her resume and limited experience with the newer marketing platforms, she was already considered obsolete. As Karen drove home through the winding streets of Oakwood Heights, her knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. The perfectly maintained properties with their tasteful landscaping had once represented her success. She'd sold many of these homes herself, back when her name was spoken with respect at the agency, when her divorce and financial struggles weren't topics of whispered conversation. Her thoughts circled like vultures. Richard had moved on quickly, already vacationing in Santorini with his girlfriend who happened to be a former client and 15 years his junior. Her daughter Emma increasingly treated her with a mixture of embarrassment and pity. The bank had sent another letter about the mortgage, polite but firm in its reminder that her forbearance period was ending. She needed control over something, anything, in a life that felt increasingly unmoored. As she turned onto Maple Street, Karen barely registered the young man operating a lawnmower in front of one of the newer properties, until a flicker of recognition triggered her neighborhood watch instincts. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar yet out of place. Had he been the one she'd seen walking in the neighborhood earlier in the week? She slowed her car, studying him through her sunglasses. He was young, maybe 16 or 17, wearing earbuds and focused intently on his task. The property was the blue Colonial that had sold last year. She remembered because she'd unsuccessfully tried to get the listing. The owners were... She couldn't recall the name immediately, but she did remember they were one of the neighborhood's few black families. But was this actually their son? She didn't remember seeing him around before, and he wasn't wearing the logo shirt she recalled from their brief interaction days earlier. Just a plain gray t-shirt soaked with sweat, and he was moving between the house and the garden shed carrying equipment. The HOA security discussion from earlier that week surfaced in her mind, along with the comments about unfamiliar faces and reports of tools being stolen from garages in nearby subdivisions. Her responsibility as HOA vice president felt suddenly, uncomfortably present. Karen pulled her car to the curb and reached for her phone, hesitating only briefly before opening the non-emergency police line she'd saved in her contacts after the last neighborhood watch meeting. "Hello, I'd like to report a suspicious person," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I'm in Oakwood Heights on Maple Street, and there's a young man I don't recognize moving between houses with equipment. He has what looks like professional yard equipment, but doesn't appear to be with any company I recognize." She paused, then added, "Given the recent reports of break-ins, I thought it would be better to be safe than sorry." After ending the call, Karen remained parked for a moment watching. She was doing her civic duty, she told herself, protecting the neighborhood. Anyone responsible would do the same. Officer James Rivera had been 3 hours into his shift when the call came through about a suspicious person in Oakwood Heights. At 34, Rivera had served on the force for 11 years, the last 5 in this affluent suburb. As a mixed-race officer, his father Puerto Rican, his mother Irish-American, he'd navigated the complex racial dynamics of policing with a hard-earned awareness of the currents that ran beneath surface interactions. "Dispatch says it's another suspicious person in Oakwood," his partner, Officer Dalton, remarked as they turned toward the neighborhood. "$10 says it's a delivery guy or lawn service." Rivera nodded without commenting. These calls had increased over the past year as the demographics of the area gradually shifted, with more families of color moving into what had historically been an overwhelmingly white enclave. The department had recently initiated training on bias-aware response, but the practical application remained inconsistent at best. "I'll take lead on this one," Rivera said as they approached the address. Standard procedure would be for both officers to approach, but for certain calls, Rivera had learned that a solitary approach could de-escalate a situation before it began. Dalton, a 20-year veteran with more traditional views on policing, had grudgingly come to respect Rivera's judgment in these scenarios. The blue Colonial came into view, along with the subject of the call, a black teenager methodically mowing the front lawn. Rivera immediately recognized the non-event nature of the situation, but would still need to follow protocol by making contact. He parked the patrol car and stepped out alone, leaving Dalton monitoring from the vehicle. As he approached, Rivera deliberately kept his hand away from his weapon, maintaining what the Academy called a non-threatening but alert posture. The teenager hadn't noticed his arrival, focused on his task with earbuds in place, not the behavior of someone engaged in suspicious activity, Rivera noted mentally. He stopped at the edge of the property and raised his hand in a casual wave, waiting to be seen rather than startling the young man. Marcus's rhythm was interrupted by movement in his peripheral vision. He looked up to see a police cruiser parked at the curb and an officer standing at the edge of the lawn. The sudden spike of adrenaline was immediate and familiar, a physiological response his mother had prepared him for, but that no amount of preparation fully mitigated. He shut off the mower and removed his earbuds in one fluid motion. Every lesson his parents had ever given him about encounters with law enforcement, crystallizing into a single imperative: remain calm, speak clearly, make no sudden movements. "Afternoon," the officer said, his tone conversational. "Sorry to interrupt your work. I'm Officer Rivera. Do you live here or work for a lawn service?" Marcus stood very still beside his mower. "I live here, sir. This is my parents' house." He gestured toward the property, conscious of keeping his movements measured. "I also run my own lawn service business, but right now I'm just mowing our lawn." Officer Rivera nodded, his expression giving away nothing. "What's your name?" "Marcus Johnson, sir." "Do you have any identification on you, Marcus?" The question sent a ripple of indignation through him, quickly suppressed. He was standing in his own front yard, but Marcus knew the script. "My school ID is in my wallet in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's okay." The officer nodded and Marcus slowly retrieved his wallet, extracting his Oakwood Heights high school ID card with its photograph and name clearly visible. "Marcus." The voice cut through the tension like a thunderclap. Both Marcus and Officer Rivera turned to see Diane Johnson striding up the driveway, her court briefcase still in hand, her expression a carefully controlled mask of professional fury. "What's happening here?" "Ma'am, I'm Officer Rivera. We received a call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. I'm just verifying." "You're verifying that my son is suspicious for mowing his own lawn?" Diane's voice was precise, each word articulated with the clarity of someone who chose her language with professional care. She set her briefcase down and pulled out her phone. "I'd like to record this interaction, Officer Rivera." "You have that right, ma'am." "Marcus, please come stand by me," Diane said, not taking her eyes off the officer. Marcus complied, sensing the shift in dynamics. His mother's presence altered the geometry of the situation, introducing a counterbalance of authority. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm simply responding to a call," Officer Rivera explained, his tone remaining even. "Once I verify residents, we'll be on our way." "And how many calls do you respond to about suspicious white teenagers mowing lawns in this neighborhood?" "Officer?" Diane asked, her phone steadily recording. "I'm curious about the departmental statistics on that." A second officer had emerged from the patrol car, approaching with a more assertive posture. "Everything okay here, Rivera?" "It's fine, Dalton. Mr. Johnson here lives at this residence with his mother." Rivera gestured toward Diane. "Mrs. Johnson, if you could just confirm your address for our report, we'll be out of your way." From across the street, Sadie Chen had stepped onto her porch at the sight of the police cruiser. At 38, Sadie had moved to Oakwood Heights just 6 months earlier, attracted by the school district and safe streets for her 7-year-old daughter, Lily. As an organizational psychologist who specialized in diversity consultations for corporations, Sadie had a professional interest in community dynamics and a personal stake in how those dynamics affected families of color. She watched the interaction unfolding on the Johnsons' lawn with growing concern, noting the careful way Marcus stood, the protective stance of his mother, the body language of the two officers. When a white Lexus SUV drove slowly past the scene, pausing briefly before continuing down the street, Sadie's suspicions about the source of the call solidified. Making a decision, she stepped off her porch and crossed the street. If nothing else, her presence would provide another witness and potentially shift the power balance of the encounter. "Hi there," she called as she approached, her tone deliberately casual. "Everything okay, Marcus? I was just about to ask if you could add me to your schedule for next week. My regular service is booked up." Marcus glanced at her with surprise. They'd only exchanged brief waves before, but quickly understood her intention. "Hi, Miss Chen. Yeah, I can probably fit you in on Tuesday if that works." Officer Rivera observed the interaction with a slight tightening around his eyes. Recognition of the dynamics at play. "As I was explaining to Mrs. Johnson, we're just responding to a routine call. Since we've confirmed that Marcus is a resident, we'll be on our way." "Of course," Sadie replied pleasantly. "Though I hope whoever made that call is getting equally thorough follow-up about making false reports." Her smile remained in place, but the challenge in her words was unmistakable. Officer Dalton shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience. Other neighbors had begun to appear on porches and at windows, drawn by the unusual sight of police presence in the quiet neighborhood. "We'll make a note that this residence is operated by a legitimate lawn service," Rivera said, directing his comment to Diane. "That should prevent any future misunderstandings." "The misunderstanding," Diane replied evenly, "is not about my son's business. It's about who belongs in this neighborhood and who doesn't. My son will not be carrying special papers to prove his right to exist in his own community." Marcus felt a complicated mixture of pride and discomfort at his mother's words. Her protection was fierce and necessary, but each such incident added another small weight to the accumulating burden he carried, the awareness that he would always be seen as out of place, always subject to justifying his presence. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Johnson," Officer Rivera said, and something in his tone suggested he truly might. "We're just doing our job responding to calls." "And I'm doing mine protecting my son," she replied, her attorney's training evident in her composed determination. With a final nod, the officers returned to their vehicle. As they drove away, Diane's professional composure wavered slightly, her hand finding Marcus's shoulder and squeezing tight. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm fine, Mom," he answered. Automatically, though, they both recognized the inadequacy of the response. Fine was a placeholder for emotions too complicated to unpack on their front lawn under the watchful eyes of neighbors. Sadie Chen approached them, her expression sympathetic but not pitying, a distinction Marcus immediately appreciated. "That was completely unacceptable," she said. "I'm Sadie, by the way. We haven't formally met." "Diane Johnson," his mother replied, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming over." "I've only been here 6 months, but I've already noticed the pattern," Sadie said. "The constant checking of who belongs and who doesn't." She glanced at Marcus. "Your lawn service has a really good reputation, by the way. I wasn't just saying that." A faint smile lifted the corner of Marcus's mouth. "Thanks. I do have an opening on Tuesday if you're interested." This small return to normalcy, discussing business, making plans, felt like reclaiming something that had been momentarily stolen. But Marcus was acutely aware of the neighbors still watching from windows and porches, of the doorbell camera that had captured the entire interaction, of the low hum of conversation that would inevitably spread through community group chats and texts. The invisible boundaries of Oakwood Heights had just been made starkly visible. drawn in sharp relief against the backdrop of his family's carefully maintained lawn. The property he'd been mowing minutes earlier, a symbol of their belonging in this community, had been transformed into the stage for a public reminder of their tenuous status. Diane was already scrolling through her phone, her expression hardening into resolve. "Sadie, would you mind giving me your contact information? I think we may need to have some neighborhood conversations in the near future." As the three of them stood in the yard making plans, none noticed the white Lexus parked a block away, Karen Whitley sitting motionless behind the wheel, watching the aftermath of what she'd set in motion. Her grip on her phone tightened as discomfort crept through her certainty. This wasn't how she'd imagined the scenario unfolding when she'd made the call. The police arriving at a family home, the professional-looking mother confronting them, neighbors gathering. She'd only wanted to protect the community, to fulfill her responsibilities. But as she watched Diane Johnson's protective stance beside her son, a gnawing doubt took root alongside her justifications. Karen put her car in drive and pulled away from the curb, unable to look away from her rearview mirror until the blue house disappeared from view. The confrontation had ended, but its ripples were just beginning to spread through Oakwood Heights. The blue glow of her laptop screen illuminated Diane Johnson's face as she sat at her kitchen table long after Marcus had gone to bed. The doorbell. Camera footage played on a loop before her, each viewing stoking the careful, controlled rage she had cultivated through years of practicing civil rights law. 15 minutes of video capturing her son's humiliation, his careful stillness, his deliberately measured responses to questions he should never have had to answer. Professional training warred with maternal fury as Diane's cursor hovered over the post button. As an attorney, she understood the potential consequences of making this footage public, the exposure, the scrutiny, the inevitable backlash. As a mother, she saw only her child, forced to justify his existence in a space that should have been safe. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sadie Chen. "Have you decided about posting it?" "Finalizing my statement now," Diane replied. "Then it goes live." She returned to her carefully crafted statement. "Today, my 15-year-old son Marcus was confronted by police while mowing our lawn in Oakwood Heights. A neighbor reported him as a suspicious person with dangerous equipment. This is what racial profiling looks like in safe suburbs. A black honor student becomes threatening the moment he picks up lawn equipment. The caller didn't recognize him as a resident despite his family living here for 3 years and his lawn business serving multiple neighborhood clients. This happens every day across America, usually without video evidence. I'm sharing this because silence perpetuates these incidents. To our white neighbors, this is not about your comfort or intentions. It's about our safety and right to exist unquestioned in our own community. At 11:42 p.m., Diane Johnson published the post to her public Facebook and Twitter profiles, tagging local civil rights organizations and community leaders. Then she closed her laptop knowing that by morning everything would change. Emma Whitley first saw the video during third period AP US History. A notification lit up her phone screen, a text from her friend Zoe with multiple exclamation points and a link. "OMG, is this your mom?" Concealing her phone beneath her desk, Emma clicked the link and felt the blood drain from her face as the doorbell camera footage began to play. The caption identified the person who had called the police as an Oakwood Heights HOA board member, driving a white Lexus SUV. Even without her mother being named, Emma recognized the situation immediately. Her mother's car. Her mother's voice on the police dispatch audio that someone had overlaid on the video. Marcus Johnson, whom Emma knew from debate club, standing stiffly beside his lawnmower while police questioned him. By lunch period, Emma could barely breathe through the tightness in her chest. In the cafeteria, conversations hushed as she entered, eyes following her movement. At 16, Emma had spent the past 2 years establishing her identity as socially conscious and progressive, posting about climate activism, attending Black Lives Matter rallies, challenging outdated viewpoints in class discussions. And now, overnight, she had become the daughter of lawnmower Karen. She spotted Marcus sitting with his usual friends across the cafeteria. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, his expression unreadable. The shame that washed over Emma was physically painful. Without stopping at her usual table, Emma walked straight out of the cafeteria and into the restroom, where she locked herself in a stall and pulled out her phone. Her hands shook as she opened Instagram and began typing. "I need to make something. Clear. The woman in the video circulating today is my mother. I had nothing to do with her actions, and I absolutely condemn what she did. Marcus, I am so deeply sorry. What happened to you was racist, inexcusable, and traumatic. To everyone else, please understand that I do not share my mother's views. I stand firmly against racism in all its forms, including the kind that pretends to be neighborhood safety. I am deeply ashamed and will be having serious conversations at home about this." Emma pressed post before she could second-guess herself, then turned off notifications as her phone immediately began buzzing with responses. The line had been drawn. There would be no going back. Karen Whitley sat frozen in her home office, staring at her computer screen as notifications poured in. The neighborhood Facebook group had exploded overnight, with several posts linking to the video and directly naming her as the caller. Her email inbox filled with messages from former clients and colleagues, some expressing concern, others canceling lunch plans or withdrawing invitations. The most devastating blow had come from Emma's Instagram post, which someone had helpfully screenshot and emailed to her with the subject line, "Even your daughter knows you're racist." Karen's hands shook as she closed her browser, unable to read another word. This wasn't fair. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd followed proper procedure, reporting genuinely suspicious activity. Anyone in her position would have done the same. The fact that the person happened to be black wasn't her fault. It wasn't about race. It was about safety. The justifications circled in her mind as she paced her living room, its carefully selected furnishings suddenly seeming like a hollow stage set. Her phone rang. Walter Prescott, the HOA president. Karen let it go to voicemail, unable to face whatever carefully worded suggestion he might make about her stepping back from her board position. When the doorbell rang, Karen froze in panic before cautiously approaching the window. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, she saw a news van parked at the curb, a reporter standing on her porch with a microphone. Karen retreated to her bedroom, where she drew the blinds and sank onto the edge of her bed. A text notification lit up her phone. "Mom, we need to talk when I get home from school. What you did was wrong." Emma Karen stared at the message, tears spilling down her cheeks. Everything was falling apart, and somehow she had become the villain in a story where she had only been trying to protect her community. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the row of neatly aligned client files on his desk. The spreadsheets and schedules that had given him such pride now seemed trivial. His phone had been buzzing constantly, some messages from friends offering support, others from strangers who had somehow found his business page to leave messages of solidarity. The video had gone far beyond their neighborhood, spreading to local news outlets and national civil rights organizations. His mother had received calls from activists, attorneys, journalists, and well-meaning white people wanting to express that they weren't like that. Through it all, Marcus had maintained the composed exterior he'd perfected over years of navigating predominantly white spaces. He'd nodded appropriately when his debate coach had awkwardly expressed her support. He'd given measured responses to friends who asked if he was okay. He'd reassured his mother that he was handling things fine. But alone in his room, with no performance required, Marcus finally allowed the mask to slip. His hands began to shake first, then his shoulders, until finally his whole body was racked with silent sobs. The careful compartmentalization he'd maintained crumbled, leaving raw hurt and rage in its place. What cut deepest wasn't the embarrassment or even the injustice. It was the shattering of the illusion he'd allowed himself to believe. That if he did everything right, spoke properly, dressed appropriately, achieved academically, built a legitimate business, somehow the rules would apply equally to him. That he could earn belonging through excellence. The incident had stripped away that comforting fiction, revealing the ugly truth. No amount of achievement could protect him from being seen as inherently suspicious. His carefully constructed business plan with its professional logo and meticulous scheduling suddenly seemed naive. A child's attempt to craft armor from paper. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Marcus, can I come in?" His mother's voice carried a gentleness she reserved for their most difficult conversations. He quickly wiped his face, reconstructing his composure. "Yeah, come in." Diane entered and sat beside him on the bed. "Someone's here to see you. George Harrington. Says he needs to talk to you about his lawn service." Marcus frowned. "Did he cancel?" "I don't think so. He seems uncomfortable, but insistent." She studied her son's face. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to." Marcus considered this, then shook his head. "No, I'll talk to him." The alternative, hiding while his mother handled his business, felt too much like surrender. Downstairs, George Harrington stood awkwardly in the living room, his weathered hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. At 82, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man unaccustomed to uncertainty, yet everything in his demeanor suggested discomfort. "Mr. Harrington," Marcus greeted him, professional mask firmly back in place. "What can I help you with?" The older man cleared his throat. "I saw that video, the one your mother posted." He paused, visibly struggling with his words. "Wanted to make sure you knew I still expect you on Monday, for my lawn service." The statement hung in, the air laden with unspoken complexity. It wasn't quite an apology or even explicit solidarity, but in its own way it represented a choice, a small stand against the current of exclusion. "I'll be there," Marcus confirmed, maintaining his professional tone. "Same time as we scheduled." George nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. Good." He hesitated, then added, "My wife and we were one of the first families on our street. 42 years now. Seen a lot of changes." He paused again. "Not all change is bad, no matter what some folks think." With that cryptic statement, he nodded to both Marcus and Diane, then made his way to the door. It wasn't much, certainly not the full reckoning that the situation demanded, but it was something. A crack in the facade of neighborhood unity against them. After George left, Diane turned to Marcus. "There's something else we need to discuss. Sadie Chen called while you were in your room. She has a proposal for how the neighborhood might respond to this situation." Marcus tensed. "What kind of proposal?" "She wants to organize what she's calling a mow-in. Neighbors bringing their lawn equipment to mow public spaces and the lawns of clients who support you." Diane watched her son carefully. "But before I agree to anything, I need to know where you stand. This business is yours. If you want to step back from it after what happened, that's completely valid. If you want to continue but keep a lower profile, that's valid too. What do you want, Marcus?" The question hung between them. Deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. What did he want? To retreat into safety or to push forward into vulnerability? To protect himself from further exposure or to claim his rightful space despite the risks? "I need to think about it," he finally said. The admission of uncertainty itself, a kind of vulnerability he rarely allowed himself. Diane nodded, understanding. In her eyes, "Take the time you need. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." As she left him alone with his thoughts, Marcus turned back to his desk, where his business plans lay in neat, organized rows. The future he had mapped out with such care now stood at a crossroads. Continue forward into uncertain territory, or retreat to safer ground. Sadie Chen's living room had become an impromptu command center, her dining table covered with hastily drawn plans and her laptop open to a growing list of community contacts. After witnessing the incident firsthand and seeing the video spread online, Sadie had shifted instinctively into the organizational mode that had made her effective in corporate diversity initiatives. "The key is to move quickly while attention is focused," she explained to Diane over speakerphone as she typed. "Social media outrage has a short half-life unless it translates into real-world action." "I'm concerned about putting Marcus in the spotlight again," Diane replied. "He's still processing what happened. This needs to be his choice." "Of course," Sadie agreed immediately. "This isn't about using him as a symbol. It's about the community taking responsibility instead of leaving your family to bear the burden alone. She paused her typing. How is he doing, really? The line went quiet before Diane answered. He's doing what Black children are taught to do, maintaining composure, focusing on solutions rather than feelings. But when he thinks no one is watching, she didn't finish the sentence. Sadie closed her eyes briefly, recognizing the weight of what remained unspoken. I understand. My parents raised me with similar expectations. Channel everything into achievement, never show vulnerability. It shouldn't have to be this way, Diane said quietly. No, it shouldn't. Sadie opened her eyes, resolve hardening. That's why this can't just be about one incident or one person's actions. It has to address the systems that made this possible. She hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. Emma Whitley, Karen's daughter, posted something publicly distancing herself from her mother's actions. It's causing quite a stir among the younger residents. That couldn't have been easy for her, Diane acknowledged, regardless of how I feel about her mother. The generational divide is significant, Sadie noted. We might be able to leverage that energy. She glanced at her notes. I've already heard from 12 neighbors willing to participate in a public show of support. If Marcus decides he wants to continue his business, we can make that statement immediately. If he needs time, we pivot to a community dialogue instead. As evening settled over the neighborhood, different households retreated into their private responses to the public controversy. Karen Whitley sat alone in her darkened living room, waiting for Emma to return home for the conversation that would forever alter their relationship. Marcus Johnson finally allowed himself to rest, emotional exhaustion overcoming the anxiety that had kept him alert. George Harrington sat with his wife of 59 years, having a halting but necessary conversation about changes they had witnessed and participated in throughout their lives. And in dozens of other homes, residents of Oakwood Heights watched the video that had exposed their community's unspoken tensions, each confronting their own position in the unfolding story, whether as active participants, silent witnesses, or reluctant reckoners with uncomfortable truths about the place they called home. The digital wildfire had illuminated corners of their community that many had preferred to keep in shadow. What would emerge from that light remained to be seen. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect early summer day that typically found Oakwood Heights residents tending gardens, walking dogs, or gathering for impromptu cul-de-sac conversations. But there was nothing typical about this particular Saturday, as residents emerged from their homes with a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate in the air, like the distant rumble of approaching thunder. By 9 o'clock, the community park, at the center of the neighborhood, had become the gathering point for what Sadie Chen had efficiently organized into the Community Support Mowing. Nearly 40 people, a mix of Oakwood Heights residents and supporters from surrounding areas, assembled with lawn mowers, trimmers, and gardening tools. Many wore t-shirts hastily printed with "Mow Where You Belong" and "Neighbor Suspect" slogans. Across the neighborhood, a smaller group of 15 residents arrived at Karen Whitley's colonial-style home, responding to hastily distributed flyers about an important community safety discussion. Walter Prescott, the bow-tied HOA president, had reluctantly agreed to attend what he'd carefully framed as a listening session, though his wife had pointedly chosen to stay home. The physical division of bodies in these separate spaces made visible the ideological fractures that had existed beneath Oakwood Heights' manicured surface all along. Sadie Chen stood on a park bench, clipboard in hand, her organizational skills on full display as she directed volunteers into teams. Her professional expertise in diversity consultation had prepared her for many difficult conversations, but this was personal in a way corporate work never had been. This was about the community where her 7-year-old daughter would grow up. We'll have 6 teams rotating through the public areas first, she announced, her voice clear and confident. Then we'll move to the client properties on Marcus's list where owners have given permission. Remember, this is about showing support through action, not just words. Diane Johnson stood slightly apart from the crowd, observing the gathering with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. As an attorney who had fought civil rights battles in courtrooms for years, she recognized both the power and the limitations of symbolic actions like this one. Still, she couldn't deny the emotional impact of seeing dozens of neighbors showing up in support of her son. "Quite a turnout," remarked a familiar voice beside her. Diane turned to see Officer James Rivera, dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt, rather than his uniform. His presence was surprising. Police officers rarely involved themselves in community disputes while off duty, especially those involving questions of police response. "Officer Rivera," Diane acknowledged, her tone professional but guarded. "Just James today," he replied. "I'm not here officially. Just wanted to see what was happening in my community." "And which side of this community do you stand with?" Diane asked directly. Rivera glanced across the gathering before answering. "It's complicated. I'm here because what happened to your son was wrong. The call should never have been made. But I also know that my colleagues were responding to a dispatch, following protocol." He paused. "Systems have inertia. Changing them requires pressure from both inside and outside." Before Diane could respond, her attention was drawn to a slight figure approaching quickly from the direction of the neighborhood entrance. Emma Whitley, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, her expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Mrs. Johnson?" Emma stopped before Diane, her voice slightly breathless. "I wanted to say I'm sorry about what my mom did. It was wrong and She faltered, then straightened her shoulders. "I want to help today, if that's okay." Diane studied the teenager, recognizing the personal cost of this public stance against her own mother. "That's very brave of you, Emma. I believe Sadie is assigning teams now." As Emma moved toward the gathering, Rivera raised an eyebrow. "Karen Whitley's daughter?" "Yes," Diane confirmed. She posted a public statement condemning her mother's actions the day after the video went viral. Rivera let out a low whistle. "That's going to make for some tense family dinners." "Some things are worth the discomfort," Diane replied, watching as Emma was welcomed into a team of volunteers. "Speaking of which, where's Marcus? I thought he'd decided to participate." Marcus sat in his parked car a block away from the park, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing deliberately to calm the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. The decision to participate in the Mowing had come after hours of internal debate. Part of him had wanted to withdraw completely, to close his lawn business and find some other entrepreneurial venture that didn't make him so visible. Another part recognized that retreating would feel like surrender to forces he'd been fighting his entire young life. In the end, what had tipped the balance wasn't principle, but practicality. He'd invested too much in his equipment and built too many client relationships to walk away. If he was going to continue, it would have to be on his own terms, not shaped by fear. But knowing the right choice intellectually didn't make it emotionally easier to step into a public event where he would inevitably become the center of attention, again. Where news cameras would capture his every expression, where neighbors would watch him with sympathy that sometimes felt nearly as uncomfortable as suspicion. A gentle tap on his window startled him from his thoughts. His mother stood outside the car, concern evident in her expression. Marcus rolled down the window. "You okay?" she asked simply. "Yeah," he replied automatically, then amended. "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." Diane nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You don't have to be the perfect symbolic victim in all this, Marcus. You're allowed to be angry, to be uncomfortable, to set boundaries. This isn't a performance for white comfort." The bluntness of her statement made him laugh unexpectedly. "Mom, you're literally describing a performance I'm about to give." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Then perform on your own terms. Remember what Grandma always said. You don't have to be twice as good, but you do have to be authentically you," Marcus finished. His grandmother's revision of the traditional black parental advice had been a touchstone in their household. "Come when you're ready," Diane said, stepping back from the car. Not a minute before. As she walked away, Marcus took one more deep breath, then opened the car door. There would never be a perfect moment of readiness. Sometimes courage was simply the decision to move forward anyway. Karen Whitley arranged coffee mugs on her dining room table with precise movements, channeling her anxiety into the familiar territory of hospitality. Through her front window, she could see neighbors arriving, their expressions ranging from grim determination to obvious discomfort. None of them seemed particularly happy to be there, but their presence felt like the first tendrils of support after days of isolation and mounting public criticism. Her home, usually immaculate, showed subtle signs of disorder. Mail piled unopened on a side table, a jacket draped over a chair rather than hung in the closet. Small indicators of a life disrupted. Karen. Walter Prescott greeted her at the door, his bow tie as precisely knotted as ever despite the tension evident in his posture. I hope you understand that my presence here doesn't constitute an official HOA position on the matter. Of course not, Karen replied, the professional smile she'd perfected in real estate automatically appearing. I appreciate you coming to. Listen, Walter. There are perspectives that aren't being heard in all this outrage. As more neighbors filtered in, mostly older residents who had lived in Oakwood Heights for decades, Karen found herself searching for Emma among them. Her daughter had left early that morning without explanation, their latest tense exchange still hanging in the air between them. You're hosting people to defend what you did? Emma had asked incredulously when Karen mentioned the gathering. Do you actually think what you did was right? I think it's been completely misrepresented, Karen had replied, her defenses rising. If he had been a white teenager, I would have made the same call. Emma's expression had hardened. You can't possibly believe that. The memory of her daughter's disappointment stung more sharply than the angry emails from strangers or the news vans that had camped outside her home. But there was no time to dwell on it, as Nancy Keller, the HOA treasurer, approached with a sympathetic expression. This whole thing has just been blown completely out of proportion, Nancy said, patting Karen's arm. Anyone would have had concerns about an unfamiliar person with equipment moving between properties. Karen nodded, finding momentary comfort in the validation. That's exactly what I've been saying. It wasn't about race, it was about community safety. And now they're turning it into this huge racial incident, added Robert Wilson, a retired banker from the north end of the neighborhood, making you out to be some kind of monster when you were just following neighborhood watch guidelines. The conversation continued in this vein as more neighbors arrived, a chorus of sympathetic voices reinforcing Karen's narrative that she had been unfairly targeted, that the situation had been manipulated to advance political agendas about racism. The echo chamber effect was both comforting and disorienting. Part of her absorbed the validation hungrily, while another part registered the conspicuous absence of any neighbors under 50 or any people of color in her living room. I think we need to address this cancel culture mentality, Walter was saying, standing near her fireplace with the air of someone accustomed to leading discussions. The idea that one mistake, if we even grant that it was a mistake, should result in demands for resignations and public shaming. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Karen nodded along but found herself suddenly wondering where George Harrington was. The elderly resident had called the previous evening to express his support and intention to attend, but was nowhere to be seen among the gathering. The Mowing had transformed from organization to action, with teams of volunteers spreading out across Oakwood Heights public spaces. The hum of lawn mowers and trimmers filled the air as flower beds were weeded, edges trimmed, and grass cut, in remarkably efficient operations. Community service reimagined as public protest. Marcus found himself at the center of a team working on the neighborhood's main entrance, directing volunteers with unexpected confidence. The initial discomfort of visibility had gradually given way to a different feeling, a sense of reclaiming space that had been contested, of asserting belonging through collective action. Looking good, Marcus, called Sadie as she circulated between teams, her clipboard now augmented with a megaphone borrowed from her daughter's school spirit activities. We've got Channel 7 arriving in about 15 minutes. Are you comfortable being interviewed? Marcus hesitated, weighing the question. Maybe. Let me finish this section first. As he guided his mower along the entrance median, Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching slowly. George Harrington dressed in khaki pants and a buttoned shirt despite the growing heat of the day. The elderly man stood watching the activity for several moments before Marcus cut the engine and approached him. "Mr. Harrington," he greeted, surprise evident in his voice. "I thought—" He stopped himself, unsure how to reference what he'd overheard about the meeting at Karen's house. "Thought I'd be somewhere else today?" George finished, a hint of wry humor in his weathered face. "So did I, right up until I was halfway to that gathering." He gestured vaguely in the direction of Karen's home. "Then I recalled something my late father told me when I was about your age." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. He said, "George, there comes a time in every man's life when he has to decide whether he's going to stand with what's comfortable or what's right." Took me 82 years to really understand what he meant. The unexpected depth of the statement hung in the air between them. Marcus felt a shift in his perception of the elderly neighbor, from a somewhat prickly client to a complex individual with his own journey of understanding. "Well," Marcus said, "finally, we could use another supervisor if you're interested. These college kids have enthusiasm but questionable technique." George's face creased into a smile. "I believe I can manage that. Been watching people mow lawns in this neighborhood for 4 decades. About time I put that expertise to use." As Marcus introduced George to the team, Sadie approached with Emma Whitley in tow. "Marcus, Emma has offered to help with your team. She apparently has some experience with landscaping." Emma's discomfort was palpable as she stood before Marcus, her usual confidence dimmed by the weight of her mother's actions. "I used to help our gardener sometimes," she explained, her voice quiet. "I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I wanted to help." Marcus studied her for a moment, recognizing the courage it took for her to be here. "We could use help with those hedge trimmers," he said finally, nodding toward the equipment. "If you're comfortable with them." The relief in Emma's expression was immediate. "Yes, I can definitely do that." As the work continued, a news van from Channel 7 pulled up to the entrance, a reporter and cameraman emerging with purposeful efficiency. Simultaneously, another news crew could be seen down the street, approaching Karen's house where several attendees stood on the front lawn gesturing animatedly. The physical division of the neighborhood had become media spectacle, the competing narratives now playing out for a wider audience. Officer Rivera, who had been quietly assisting with equipment maintenance, stepped back as the cameras approached, his expression troubled as he observed both gatherings from his middle position. "They're going to want me to make a statement," Marcus said quietly to his mother, who had materialized at his side as the reporters approached. "Only if you want to," Diane reminded him. "This isn't your burden to carry." Marcus considered this, watching as Sadie stepped forward to greet the reporters with practiced poise, explaining the purpose of the event while keeping them at a respectful distance from the volunteers. He observed Emma working diligently alongside George Harrington, who was demonstrating proper hedge trimming technique with patient instruction. He noted Officer Rivera's careful neutrality, the man's position physically reflecting his complex stance between community and department. All of these people had made choices about where to stand today, physically and morally. Their presence in this space rather than the alternative gathering represented decisions about values, about who and what they would align themselves with. "I'll talk to them," Marcus decided finally. "Not as a victim, but as a business owner and resident. On my terms." As he stepped forward to meet the reporters, Marcus felt the weight of the neighborhood's attention, the burdensome visibility that had been thrust upon him. But alongside that familiar discomfort was something new, a sense of agency in choosing how to occupy this uncomfortable spotlight, how to transform unwanted attention into purposeful visibility. Across the neighborhood, through the window of her carefully maintained home, Karen Whitley watched local news footage of the protest on her living room television. The camera panned across familiar faces, neighbors she'd known for years working, alongside strangers, all united in what felt like public repudiation of her character. And there among them was her daughter Emma, demonstrating the use of hedge trimmers to a group of volunteers. The betrayal cut deep, sharpened by genuine confusion. Karen truly didn't understand how her actions, following Neighborhood Watch, Protocols reporting genuinely suspicious behavior had spiraled into this division of her community, this public shaming, this fracturing of her own family. "They're making an example of you," Nancy Keller said, watching the footage alongside her. "It's completely unfair." Karen nodded automatically, but found the words providing less comfort than they had earlier. Something about seeing the physical manifestation of the community divide, bodies literally choosing sides in spaces she had moved through comfortably for years, made the abstract concept of cancel culture suddenly, uncomfortably concrete. As the two gatherings continued their parallel existence across Oakwood Heights, each participant made visible through their presence a choice about what kind of community they wanted to build. The neat lawns and trimmed hedges left in the wake of the protest teams would remain long after the day's events concluded, visible reminders of invisible divides that could no longer be ignored beneath the neighborhood's manicured surface. The Sunday morning quiet of Oakwood Heights was shattered by Diane Johnson's sharp intake of breath as she stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. The lawn that had been meticulously maintained during yesterday's community protest was now a scarred battlefield, patches torn up by what appeared to be tire tracks, chemical burns spelling out crude messages in the grass, and most shocking of all, stark red spray paint across their garage door forming a racial slur visible from the street. "Marcus," she called, her voice strained but controlled. "Stay inside." But it was too late. Her son had already appeared behind her, his expression shifting from sleepy confusion to stunned disbelief as he took in the destruction. For several heartbeats, neither of them spoke, the magnitude of the violation settling over them like a physical weight. "I'm calling the police," Diane said finally, her attorney's mind already cataloging evidence even as her mother's heart raced with primal fear. This wasn't property damage. This was a threat. Marcus remained on the porch, his body unnaturally still. "They drove through the side yard," he observed, his voice flat and detached. "Tore up the garden beds. Looks like they used some kind of weed killer to burn patterns in the grass." His analytical approach was both a defensive mechanism and a practical assessment of the damage he would eventually need to repair. Neighbors began emerging from nearby homes, drawn by the commotion. Sadie Chen was among the first to arrive, immediately moving to stand beside the Johnsons in solidarity. Others followed, some approaching with obvious shock and sympathy, others hanging back uncertainly. Within 20 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb. Officer Rivera stepped out of the first, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted Diane with formal respect. "We'll need to document everything before any cleanup begins. I've called in our hate crimes investigator." The explicit naming of the incident's nature, not simple vandalism but a hate crime, hung in the air. As more neighbors gathered and police began stringing yellow tape around the property, Marcus retreated into the house. Diane found him in the kitchen, methodically making coffee as if it were any normal Sunday morning. "We don't have to stay here tonight," she said quietly. "We could go to a hotel or to Uncle James's place." Marcus shook his head, his movements precise as he measured coffee grounds. "That's what they want, to make us feel unsafe in our own home." He paused. "Do you think it was them, the people from her house yesterday?" The question referenced what? They both knew, that suspicion would immediately fall on Karen Whitley or her supporters. "I don't know," Diane answered honestly. "Let's not jump to conclusions before the police investigate." But as she rejoined Officer Rivera outside, it was clear that others had already formed their own conclusions. Whispers circulated among the growing crowd of neighbors, glances directed toward the far end of the street where Karen's house stood. "We'll need access to any security footage you might have," Rivera was saying, gesturing to the doorbell camera that had captured the original confrontation, "and we'll be canvassing neighbors for their security footage as well." By noon, the crowd had grown to include local news crews, community activists alerted through social media, and curious residents from surrounding neighborhoods. The vandalism had transformed from a personal violation to a public spectacle. Each visitor's shocked reaction forcing the Johnsons to relive the initial trauma. Karen Whitley first learned of the incident from a neighborhood group text, her phone buzzing insistently beside her bed early Sunday morning. The message was brief but devastating. Someone vandalized the Johnsons' house with racist graffiti last night. Police investigating as hate crime. Her first reaction was visceral denial. This couldn't be related to her or to yesterday's community division. Oakwood Heights didn't have that kind of overt racism. This had to be outside troublemakers. But as she scrolled through subsequent messages, the implication became clear. Several neighbors were openly wondering about connections to yesterday's events, with thinly veiled references to those who opposed the protest. A cold wave of fear washed over Karen. People would assume she was involved. Her already damaged reputation would be irreparably destroyed. She was still sitting frozen on her bed when Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. Their interactions had been minimal since Emma's participation in the protest. "Have you seen what happened?" Emma asked, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Karen nodded numbly. "It's awful. Truly awful. Are you going over there?" The question carried an implicit challenge. What side would Karen choose in this moment of crisis? I don't think they'd want to see me," Karen replied hesitantly. "Given everything that's happened." Emma's expression hardened. "So you're just going to hide in here while people think you had something to do with it? That's your plan?" "Emma, it's more complicated than that. The Johnsons have no reason to welcome my presence right now." "It's not about you being welcomed," Emma shot back. "It's about doing what's right even when it's uncomfortable. Isn't that what you always taught me?" Before Karen could respond, Emma had turned and stalked away, the front door slamming moments later. Karen remained sitting on her bed, emotion building in her chest, a complicated mixture of indignation, fear, and beneath it all a growing seed of genuine horror at what had been done to the Johnson family. Officer Rivera stood in Diane Johnson's living room, studying the security footage from the doorbell camera and a neighbor's surveillance system. The grainy nighttime video showed a pickup truck with its license plate obscured stopping outside the Johnson home. 3 figures emerged, young men based on their build and movement, faces concealed by hoodies and tactical-style masks. "We've got partial images of the vehicle," Rivera explained to Diane. "Modified Ford F-150, distinctive aftermarket wheels. We're checking for matches within a 20-mile radius." "So not someone from Oakwood Heights?" Diane observed, the implication clear. Rivera's expression remained professionally neutral. "We can't confirm that yet, but the vehicle doesn't match any registered in this immediate neighborhood." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. One of the perpetrators left behind a keychain with an emblem associated with a local hate group. We've had encounters with them before, primarily recruiting at high schools in the eastern part of the county." The information landed heavily. This wasn't random vandalism or even a spontaneous response to yesterday's neighborhood division. It was organized hatred, deliberately targeting her family. "So, what happens now?" Diane asked, her legal mind already calculating next steps. "We continue the investigation, identify the perpetrators, and pursue charges," Rivera answered firmly. "But I also want to ensure your family's safety. I'm recommending increased patrols in the area, and I'd suggest you consider additional security measures." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Diane could see several neighbors with cleaning supplies arriving, led by Sadie Chen, who was organizing them into teams. Among them, to her shock, was Karen Whitley, standing awkwardly at the edge of the group with cleaning supplies in hand. Outside, where yesterday's Mowing had carried an almost festive energy of community solidarity, today's gathering held the somber weight of collective shock. Neighbors worked silently scrubbing at the garage door, applying solvent to the spray paint that had already been documented by police. Diane approached the group, her expression guarded as she noticed Karen standing uncertainly among them. Sadie intercepted her first, speaking quietly. "I hope it's okay that I organized this. People wanted to help, and I thought a coordinated effort would be better than random well-wishers showing up all day." "Thank you," Diane replied sincerely. It helps to have people here. Her gaze shifted to Karen, the unspoken question evident. Sadie followed her glance. She showed up about 15 minutes ago with cleaning supplies. I wasn't sure if you'd want her here, but it's fine, Diane decided after a moment's consideration. Everyone working to remove hate is welcome. As Sadie returned to coordinating the cleanup, Karen hesitantly approached Diane, her usual confident posture replaced by uncertainty. I'm so sorry this happened, Karen began, her voice genuine despite its awkwardness. It's absolutely horrific. I wanted you to know that I had nothing to do with it. None of us from yesterday's meeting would ever condone this kind of hateful act. Diane studied her, weighing the sincerity of the statement against her instinctive distrust. The police believe it was members of a hate group from outside the neighborhood, she said finally. Not residents. Relief visibly washed over Karen's features. Thank God for that, at least. She glanced toward the garage where neighbors worked to remove the slur. I brought industrial-strength cleaner. It works on difficult stains. The mundane practicality of the offering created an unexpected bridge between them. Not friendship or reconciliation, but a minimal common ground of basic humanity. Thank you, Diane acknowledged. The cleanup coordinator is over there. As Karen moved away, Diane noticed Marcus standing in the doorway watching the scene with obvious discomfort. Unlike yesterday's protest where he had found surprising strength and visibility, today's attention seemed to weigh on him physically. Even from a distance, she could see the slight tremor in his hands, the tight control in his posture that signaled building anxiety. She crossed to him quickly. How are you holding up? I'm okay, he answered automatically, then amended with rare vulnerability. Actually, I'm not. I can't stop thinking about them being here, on our property, while we were sleeping. It's a violation. It's okay to not be okay about it. Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the neighbors working to erase the visible evidence of hatred. I need to mow Mrs. Patel's lawn today. I promised I'd do it before she gets back from her daughter's graduation. But He stopped. Embarrassment coloring his features. I don't think I can use the mower right now, isn't that stupid? Officer Rivera stood in Diane Johnson's living room, studying the security footage from the doorbell camera and a neighbor's surveillance system. The grainy nighttime video showed a pickup truck with its license plate obscured stopping outside the Johnson home. 3 figures emerged, young men based on their build and movement, faces concealed by hoodies and tactical-style masks. We've got partial images of the vehicle, Rivera explained to Diane. Modified Ford F-150, distinctive aftermarket wheels. We're checking for matches within a 20-mile radius. So not someone from Oakwood Heights? Diane observed, the implication clear. Rivera's expression remained professionally neutral. We can't confirm that yet, but the vehicle doesn't match any registered in this immediate neighborhood. He hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. One of the perpetrators left behind a keychain with an emblem associated with a local hate group. We've had encounters with them before, primarily recruiting at high schools in the eastern part of the county. The information landed heavily. This wasn't random vandalism or even a spontaneous response to yesterday's neighborhood division. It was organized hatred, deliberately targeting her family. So, what happens now? Diane asked, her legal mind already calculating next steps. We continue the investigation, identify the perpetrators, and pursue charges, Rivera answered firmly. But I also want to ensure your family's safety. I'm recommending increased patrols in the area, and I'd suggest you consider additional security measures. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Diane could see several neighbors with cleaning supplies arriving, led by Sadie Chen, who was organizing them into teams. Among them, to her shock, was Karen Whitley, standing awkwardly at the edge of the group with cleaning supplies in hand. Outside, where yesterday's Mowing had carried an almost festive energy of community solidarity, today's gathering held the somber weight of collective shock. Neighbors worked silently scrubbing at the garage door, applying solvent to the spray paint that had already been documented by police. Diane approached the group, her expression guarded as she noticed Karen standing uncertainly among them. Sadie intercepted her first, speaking quietly. "I hope it's okay that I organized this. People wanted to help, and I thought a coordinated effort would be better than random well-wishers showing up all day." "Thank you," Diane replied sincerely. "It helps to have people here." Her gaze shifted to Karen, the unspoken question evident. Sadie followed her glance. "She showed up about 15 minutes ago with cleaning supplies. I wasn't sure if you'd want her here, but it's fine," Diane decided after a moment's consideration. "Everyone working to remove hate is welcome." As Sadie returned to coordinating the cleanup, Karen hesitantly approached Diane, her usual confident posture replaced by uncertainty. "I'm so sorry this happened," Karen began, her voice genuine despite its awkwardness. "It's absolutely horrific. I wanted you to know that I had nothing to do with it. None of us from yesterday's meeting would ever condone this kind of hateful act." Diane studied her, weighing the sincerity of the statement against her instinctive distrust. "The police believe it was members of a hate group from outside the neighborhood," she said finally. "Not residents." Relief visibly washed over Karen's features. "Thank God for that, at least." She glanced toward the garage where neighbors worked to remove the slur. "I brought industrial-strength cleaner. It works on difficult stains." The mundane practicality of the offering created an unexpected bridge between them. Not friendship or reconciliation, but a minimal common ground of basic humanity. "Thank you," Diane acknowledged. "The cleanup coordinator is over there." As Karen moved away, Diane noticed Marcus standing in the doorway watching the scene with obvious discomfort. Unlike yesterday's protest where he had found surprising strength and visibility, today's attention seemed to weigh on him physically. Even from a distance, she could see the slight tremor in his hands, the tight control in his posture that signaled building anxiety. She crossed to him quickly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," he answered automatically, then amended with rare vulnerability. "Actually, I'm not. I can't stop thinking about them being here, on our property, while we were sleeping. It's a violation. It's okay to not be okay about it." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the neighbors working to erase the visible evidence of hatred. "I need to mow Mrs. Patel's lawn today. I promised I'd do it before she gets back from her daughter's graduation. But He stopped, embarrassment coloring his features. "I don't think I can use the mower right now, isn't that stupid?" Throughout the debate, Marcus and Diane Johnson remained silent observers, the burden of education once again falling implicitly to those who had been harmed. As the meeting concluded with tentative approval for Sadie's proposal and several security initiatives, Karen Whitley approached the Johnsons with visible hesitation. "I wanted to let you know," she said, addressing Diane directly, "that I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Not just today, but everything. I still believe I was following proper safety protocols when I made that call, but I'm beginning to understand that there's a context I wasn't considering. The impact was not what I intended." It wasn't quite an apology, but it represented a crack in the defensive armor Karen had maintained since the initial incident. Diane acknowledged the statement with a nod, neither accepting nor rejecting its limited recognition. "Safety means different things to different people," she replied carefully. "For some, it's about protecting property values and maintaining order. For others, it's about not being seen as inherently dangerous while simply existing in their own space." The exchange was interrupted by Emma approaching, her stance suggesting she had been watching and waiting for an appropriate moment. "Mom," she said, addressing Karen with cautious formality, "I'm heading home now. Are you coming?" The question offered a tentative olive branch, not forgiveness or agreement, but a willingness to occupy the same space again. Karen nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Yes, let's go home." She turned back to Diane. "If there's anything else your family needs during the cleanup, please let us know." As mother and daughter walked away, Marcus watched with a complicated expression. "Do you think she actually gets it now?" he asked his mother quietly. Diane considered the question, Her answer measured. I think she's beginning to understand that there's something to get. That's not the same as true understanding, but it's a start. They stood together as neighbors dispersed from the meeting, the summer evening settling over Oakwood Heights with deceptive tranquility. The physical evidence of hatred had been mostly erased from their property, but its impact remained in Marcus's anxiety about resuming his lawn work, in Diane's heightened vigilance, in the subtle but profound shift in how they experienced their home. Yet alongside that lingering trauma, something else had emerged, a community response that, while imperfect and sometimes self-serving, had created space for difficult conversations that had long been avoided. The breaking point had forced a reckoning that polite suburban norms would have otherwise contained indefinitely. The Oakwood Heights clubhouse had been transformed. Instead of the usual chairs in neat rows facing a podium, circular tables with 5 chairs each were strategically positioned to create what Sadie Chen described as containers for dialogue. Each table held discussion prompts, a timer, and guidelines for respectful engagement. The physical setup matters, Sadie explained to her volunteer facilitators an hour before the community dialogue was scheduled to begin. Circles create equality. No head of the table, no back row to hide in. Among the volunteers was Officer Rivera, out of uniform and initially hesitant about participating. I'm not sure I should be facilitating, he had admitted. My position is complicated. That's exactly why you should, Sadie had countered. Authentic dialogue needs multiple perspectives, especially those that bridge different worlds. As residents began arriving, the nervous energy was palpable. Karen Whitley came early, choosing a seat that allowed her to observe the entrance, her posture reflecting both commitment and apprehension. Diane Johnson entered with practiced poise, the professional mask she wore in contentious courtrooms firmly in place. In a separate room, a youth dialogue had been organized for teenage residents. Marcus had agreed to participate only after confirming that the session would have its own framework. I'm not interested in educating other kids about racism, he had told his mother bluntly. That's not my job. At 7 o'clock, Sadie moved to the center of the room, her professional demeanor subtly different from her usual neighborly presence. This was Sadie the consultant, focused, strategic, and unapologetically direct. Welcome to our community dialogue, she began. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that this isn't going to be easy. Meaningful conversations rarely are. We're here because our community experienced a crisis that revealed deeper tensions that have existed beneath the surface for a long time. She gestured to the tables around the room. You've been pre-assigned to groups that intentionally mix different perspectives and experiences. Your table facilitator will guide you through structured activities designed to promote listening and understanding, not debate or defense. With that introduction, participants moved to find their assigned tables, reorganizing into clusters of neighbors who had often lived near each other for years without ever engaging in meaningful conversation. At table 3, Karen Whitley found herself seated with Diane Johnson, George Harrington, Nancy Keller from the HOA board, and Miguel Vega, a newer resident. Officer Rivera stood behind his chair, serving as their facilitator. Our first exercise, Rivera explained following Sadie's protocol, is called When I Enter a Room. Each person will complete the sentence. When I enter a room of strangers, the first thing I worry they might think about me is... He set the timer for 2 minutes of silent reflection. Karen stared at her blank note card, pen hovering uncertainly. The question seemed simple yet opened toward uncomfortable vulnerability. When the timer chimed, Rivera turned to George. Would you be willing to start, Mr. Harrington? When I enter a room of strangers, George began, the first thing I worry they might think about me is that I'm too old to have relevant opinions, that I'm stuck in the past and can't adapt to how things are now. Nancy followed. I worry people will think I'm judgmental or rigid because I'm concerned about neighborhood standards, that they'll see me as the stereotypical uptight HOA lady. When it came to Diane's turn, she paused, weighing her words carefully. When I enter a room of strangers, I worry they'll see me as the angry black woman before I even speak. that no matter my credentials or how I present myself, I'll be reduced to a stereotype that makes me easier to dismiss. The stark reality of her statement hung in the air. Karen shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that her own concerns, typically centered around being judged for her divorce or reduced financial circumstances, existed in a fundamentally different context. As the exercise progressed to deeper questions about belonging and exclusion, Karen struggled to articulate thoughts she had never been forced to examine. The question asks us to recall a time we witnessed someone being treated as if they didn't belong, Rivera prompted after Karen had been silent for several moments. I'm not sure I've seen that specifically, Karen began hesitantly. Across the table, Diane's expression remained neutral, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. May I offer an observation? She asked, her tone measured. Rivera nodded. Yes, within our guidelines of speaking from personal experience. Karen, Diane said directly, you witnessed exactly that scenario when you called the police on my son for mowing our lawn. You treated him as if he didn't belong in his own neighborhood in front of his own home. The bluntness of the statement caused Karen to physically recoil. That's not, I didn't. She stopped, flustered. I was following security protocols. It wasn't personal. But it was experienced personally, Diane countered, her professional composure intact despite the emotion beneath her words. That's the gap I'm asking you to consider. The gap between your intention, following protocols, and the impact, my son being treated as suspicious in his own yard. Rivera allowed the tension to exist, neither rushing to resolve it nor allowing it to derail the structured dialogue. Perhaps, George suggested after a weighted silence, we need to examine those protocols themselves, who they protect and who they target. The comment represented a significant evolution from his initial defense of neighborhood traditions just weeks earlier. Karen looked down at her hands, then back up at Diane. I still believe I would have made that call regardless of who was there if I didn't recognize them, she said, but her conviction had softened slightly. But I'm trying to understand how it felt from your perspective. That's a start, Diane acknowledged. Recognition that different perspectives exist is the baseline for any real conversation. In the youth session, Marcus sat in a circle with 7 other teenagers, including Emma Whitley. The facilitators had wisely abandoned any pretense of formal activities, instead creating a more organic space for conversation. So basically, Zach Peterson was saying, my parents were freaking out about property values dropping if the wrong kind of people moved in. They never said it directly, but it was obvious what they meant. Emma nodded. My mom used to talk about neighborhood character all the time, like, what does that even mean? It's just code for keeping things white and wealthy. Marcus observed the conversation with measured interest. It was hardly news to him that white parents said these things, but hearing his peers acknowledge it openly represented a type of honesty rarely displayed in Oakwood Heights. What about you, Marcus? The facilitator prompted gently. What's been your experience growing up here? Marcus considered the question, aware of the eyes on him but no longer feeling the same pressure to perform perfectionism. Depends on the day, he said finally. Some days it's just normal teenage stuff, homework, sports, hanging out. Other days it's being followed around stores or neighbors slowing down when they drive past me, or having to be 10 times more professional than any other kid running a business. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He paused, then added with unexpected candor, but the hardest part isn't the obvious stuff. It's watching people pretend it's not happening, like when teachers ignore racist comments or friends change the subject when things get uncomfortable. Emma's face flushed slightly. I've done that, she admitted. Changed the subject when I should have said something. It feels easier in the moment, but then I feel terrible later. Why do you think you do that? Marcus asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Honestly? Because it's scary to confront people. I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing or making someone mad. She met his gaze directly. But I'm realizing that's a privilege. being able to avoid discomfort while you can't. The insight created a moment of connection more authentic than any structured exercise could have manufactured. Other teens began sharing similar reflections, times they had remained silent, times they had perpetuated harmful patterns without questioning them. "The thing is," Marcus said as the conversation deepened, "I don't need white saviors or performative allyship. I need people who are willing to be uncomfortable and stay engaged anyway, who don't expect gold stars for doing the bare minimum of human decency." By the time the session neared its conclusion, something had shifted in the group dynamic. Not friendship exactly, but a foundation of honesty upon which something more genuine might eventually be built. Back in the main room, Sadie moved between tables, observing the conversations with a practiced eye. She adjusted her facilitation accordingly, providing additional structure where needed, creating space where authentic dialogue had taken root. At table 3, Diane was sharing a story she rarely told in mixed company, about the first time her son had been followed by security in a store at age 9, and how she had struggled to explain it to him without crushing his spirit. He asked me what he'd done wrong, she recounted, her professional veneer temporarily lowered to reveal the mother beneath. How do you tell a child that sometimes, no matter what he does, some people will see him as inherently suspicious, that excellence isn't always protection? The question wasn't rhetorical, and the silence that followed acknowledged there was no satisfactory answer. Karen's discomfort was visible, but to her credit, she remained present rather than retreating into defensiveness. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted quietly. "For Emma, I worried about boys pressuring her or online predators, or her making bad choices with friends, not about her being criminalized for existing in public spaces." The recognition of this fundamental difference in parental experience created a bridge of understanding, not agreement or resolution, but at least mutual recognition of differing realities. As the dialogue session moved toward its conclusion, Sadie directed each table to document specific action commitments. "Change doesn't happen through conversation alone," she reminded the room. "It happens through altered behaviors and systems." At table 3, the group had progressed to discussing concrete changes to neighborhood watch protocols, shifting from subjective assessments of who looks suspicious to objective descriptions of specific behaviors that might warrant concern. George proposed documenting the actual demographic changes over time to counter myths about sudden changes to community makeup. "Oakwood Heights has been gradually diversifying for over 15 years, he noted, not just racially but economically, and in family structure. The narrative that it's some recent invasion is simply false." Officer Rivera contributed his perspective on community policing reforms, speaking with unexpected candor about the challenges of changing institutional culture. "Individual officers can make better choices, but without systemic change, we're still working within problematic frameworks," he acknowledged. As the session drew to a close, Sadie invited representatives from each table to share their key insights and commitments. When it was table 3's turn, Karen surprised everyone by volunteering to speak. She stood somewhat stiffly, clutching her note card of talking points. "Our table discussed the gap between intentions and impact," she began, her voice slightly unsteady but gaining confidence. "I've always seen myself as a good person who wants the best for our community. It's been difficult to confront the fact that good intentions don't negate harmful impact." She glanced down at her notes, then continued with unexpected candor. "I'm still processing much of what I've heard tonight. I don't have perfect answers, but I am committing to reviewing and revising our neighborhood watch guidelines, particularly around what constitutes suspicious behavior, and to examining my own assumptions about who belongs in our spaces." It wasn't a full transformation or profound epiphany, but rather the honest beginning of a more complex understanding. As Karen returned to her seat, Diane acknowledged her effort with a slight nod, not friendship or forgiveness, but recognition of a difficult step taken. As the session concluded, the youth group rejoined the adults. Marcus and Emma emerged together, their body language suggesting a conversation of significance had occurred. When Emma approached her mother, there was a new resoluteness in her posture. "How was your session?" Karen asked. trying to gauge her daughter's mood. "Honest," Emma replied simply. For once, people actually said what they think instead of what they thought they should say. She glanced over at Marcus. "It made me realize how much energy we waste pretending everything's fine when it isn't." Karen absorbed this, recognizing the implicit challenge in her daughter's words. "Our group had some pretty direct conversations, too," she offered. Diane shared some experiences that were eye-opening. Emma studied her mother. "Are you going to resign from the HOA board?" "People are saying you should." The bluntness of the question caught Karen off guard. I don't know yet. I need to think about what would be most constructive for the community." "And for yourself," Emma added perceptively. "It's okay to admit this has been awful for you, too. Just not in the same way it's been for Marcus's family." The mature insight from her teenage daughter momentarily disoriented Karen. When had Emma developed this capacity for nuanced understanding that still somehow eluded her? Across the room, Diane and Marcus were engaged in quiet conversation with Sadie, who was explaining next steps in the community process she had designed. George Harrington had joined them, his usual gruffness tempered by what appeared to be genuine regret as he shared something about the neighborhood's early history. The clubhouse gradually emptied, participants dispersing into the warm summer evening, carrying with them varying degrees of discomfort, insight, and commitment. Some would retreat quickly into the comfort of old patterns. Others would find themselves unable to unsee what had been illuminated during the dialogue. For Karen, the evening represented a pivotal moment, not of complete transformation, but of the first genuine crack in the defensive armor she had maintained since the initial incident. As she and Emma walked to their car, she found herself contemplating not just her position on the HOA board, but her place in a community that was irrevocably changing, with or without her participation. "Mom," Emma said as they reached the car, "whatever you decide about the HOA thing, just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not to protect your reputation or because you feel guilty, but because it's actually the right thing for the community." Karen looked at her daughter with new appreciation. "When did you get so wise?" she asked, only half joking. Emma's response carried the unvarnished honesty of the youth dialogue she had just experienced. "Probably around the time I realized that most adults are just making it up as they go along, including you." The statement hung between them as they drove home. Not an accusation, but a recognition. The facades of perfect understanding and confident righteousness had been temporarily stripped away, revealing the messy, imperfect humans beneath. In that vulnerability lay the first tentative possibility of genuine connection across the divides that had seemed so impassable just weeks before. What remained to be seen was whether the momentum of this single evening of uncomfortable conversations could translate into the sustained effort required for meaningful change. As lights went out across the neighborhood, that question lingered in homes throughout Oakwood Heights, a collective homework assignment with no simple answer key. The petition appeared on Karen Whitley's doorstep on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, 3 days after the community dialogue session. Printed on crisp white paper with the Oakwood Heights HOA letterhead, it bore 37 signatures calling for her immediate resignation from the board. The formal language couldn't disguise the personal nature of the rejection. Neighbors she had greeted at community events, families whose properties she had helped value, people who had once sought her approval for landscaping changes were now publicly declaring her unfit for leadership. Karen stood in her doorway, petition in hand, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. The initial sting of humiliation was followed by defensive anger, then a quiet resignation that surprised her with its clarity. This had been inevitable, from the moment the doorbell camera footage went viral. But as she closed the door and carried the petition to her home office, something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing under the weight of public rejection, Karen found herself mentally drafting a response. Years of professional experience in real estate negotiations and months of HOA procedural work had equipped her with technical knowledge that could be repurposed. If she couldn't salvage her reputation, perhaps she could still contribute something meaningful on her way out. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop, pulling up the HOA bylaws and neighborhood watch guidelines. Her organizational skills, previously channeled into property standards enforcement, now focused on a different target, the very systems she had once enthusiastically upheld. Across the neighborhood, Marcus Johnson stood in the impeccably maintained backyard of the Prestons, one of Oakwood Heights' wealthiest families, listening with growing discomfort to James Preston's enthusiastic business proposal. "So you see, it would be a win-win," the middle-aged investment banker was explaining, gesturing expansively. "We'd provide capital for new equipment, marketing materials, maybe even a small truck with your logo. You'd expand operations beyond Oakwood Heights into the surrounding communities. 5 or 6 teams working under your brand, your management. You'd be a real entrepreneur." Preston's wife, Melissa, nodded encouragingly, adding, "We've discussed this with several neighbors, and there's a whole group willing to invest. We all believe in supporting diverse businesses, especially after everything that's happened." Marcus nodded politely, maintaining the composed professional demeanor that had become second nature. But internally, warning bells were sounding. The offer was simultaneously generous and unsettling, financial support that would genuinely help his business grow, yet framed in a way that made him feel like a charity case or, worse, a diversity initiative to ease white guilt. "That's a really interesting proposal, Mr. Preston," Marcus replied carefully. "I appreciate the vote of confidence in my business model. Would it be all right if I took some time to discuss this with my mother and develop a formal response?" Of course, Preston beamed, seemingly pleased with Marcus's measured reaction. "That's exactly the kind of professional approach we expected from you. Always so mature for your age." The comment, intended as praise, landed with unintended weight. So mature for your age, the familiar refrain that had followed Marcus through his life, the unspoken expectation that black children must demonstrate adult-level composure to be deemed acceptable. As Marcus walked home, the proposal turned over. In his mind, the practical benefits were undeniable. Expansion would mean greater income, more impressive college applications, a chance to build something larger than his original plan. But at what cost to his agency, his independence? And why was it only now, after he had become a symbol in the neighborhood's racial reckoning, that such support was being offered? The Johnson home had become an unexpected hub of community activity. In the weeks following the vandalism incident, the newly painted garage door and replanted garden beds stood as visible reminders of both hatred and healing, drawing visitors who arrived with varying degrees of awkwardness and authenticity. Today, Diane had convened an informal gathering of neighbors who had expressed genuine interest in ongoing education around racial equity. Seated in the Johnson living room were Sadie Chen, Officer Rivera, again in civilian clothes, George Harrington, 2 younger couples from the east side of the neighborhood, and somewhat surprisingly, Emma Whitley, who had arrived alone with a notebook and determined expression. "I want to start by thanking everyone for coming," Diane began, her attorney's poise softened slightly in the casual setting of her home. "After the community dialogue, many of you asked for resources or next steps. Rather than sending a reading list that might sit on your nightstand, I thought a frank conversation might be more productive." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "In the past few weeks, I've received dozens of offers of support, expressions of solidarity, and well-intentioned gestures. Some have been genuinely helpful, others," she smiled slightly, "less so. Today I'd like to talk about the difference between performance and practice when it comes to allyship." As the conversation unfolded, Diane articulated with precision the distinction between actions that centered white comfort or absolution and those that actually supported community transformation. She described neighbors who had sent elaborate flower arrangements but continued to cross the street when seeing black residents approaching. She mentioned community members who posted passionate social media statements but remained silent at HOA meetings when exclusionary policies were discussed. "True allyship isn't a t-shirt you wear or a sign in your yard," she explained. "It's a sustained practice of examining systems, redistributing power, and accepting discomfort as part of growth." Emma leaned forward, taking notes with intense concentration. "So how do we know if we're doing it right?" What's the line between trying to help and being performative? Diane considered the question thoughtfully. Ask yourself whose needs are centered in your actions. Are you doing something primarily to ease your own discomfort or look good to others? Or are you responding to what marginalized community members have actually requested? Are you willing to take action even when, especially when, no one is watching or giving you credit? George Harrington, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up with unexpected candor. I've lived here longer than anyone else in this room, he began, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. Seen a lot of changes, not all of which I welcomed at first. But I've been thinking about something my late wife used to say. The measure of a community isn't how it treats its most powerful members, but how it treats those with the least power. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I've started compiling a neighborhood history, dates, demographics, property values, documenting how this community has changed over time. The records show what many of us don't want to admit, that for decades there were informal agreements to keep certain people out. Nothing in writing, of course, but understood practices. Sadie Chen, who had been unusually quiet during the gathering, added, "That kind of documentation is crucial. We can't address what we won't acknowledge." There was something in Sadie's tone that caught Diane's attention, a personal undercurrent that went beyond professional expertise. After a moment's hesitation, Sadie continued, revealing a layer of her experience that she had previously kept private. My family tried to buy a home in this neighborhood in 1997, she said. We had the income, the credit score, everything. But somehow none of the 3 properties we bid on worked out. Always some last-minute issue, another buyer appearing suddenly. It took me years to recognize the pattern for what it was. The revelation shifted the energy in the room, connecting abstract concepts of housing discrimination to the lived reality of someone sitting among them. It also illuminated Sadie's passionate involvement in current community changes. Not simply professional interest, but personal investment in transforming a space that had once excluded her. The monthly HOA board meeting had never attracted much attention from Oakwood Heights residents, typically attended only by the board members themselves and occasionally a homeowner with a specific grievance. The meetings were procedural affairs focused on maintenance contracts and architectural approvals. Tonight's meeting, however, had drawn a standing-room-only crowd to the community center. News of the petition demanding Karen's resignation had spread throughout the neighborhood, creating speculation about potential confrontation. Additionally, the agenda included discussion of revised neighborhood watch guidelines, a topic that had taken on new significance in the wake of recent events. Walter Prescott called the meeting to order with visible discomfort, his bow tie slightly askew as he surveyed the unusually large crowd. Before we address the regular agenda items, we need to acknowledge the situation regarding board membership that has arisen. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. A petition has been submitted calling for the resignation of Vice President Whitley. According to our bylaws, such a petition requires formal consideration by the board, followed by a special election if a vacancy is created. All eyes turned to Karen, who sat with uncharacteristic stillness at the board table. Gone was the defensive posture and barely contained anxiety that had marked her public appearances since the initial incident. In its place was something more measured, not exactly peace, but a kind of focused resolution. Before the board considers that petition, Karen said, her voice steadier than anyone expected, I'd like to present a proposal that I've been developing. She distributed folders to each board member and placed additional copies on a table for community members. This is a comprehensive revision of our neighborhood security protocols and architectural standards guidelines. It addresses several problematic aspects of our current procedures that enable discriminatory application, whether intentional or unconscious. Murmurs spread through the crowd as Karen continued, systematically outlining changes that would fundamentally alter how the HOA operated, replacing subjective aesthetic standards with clear objective criteria, removing language about neighborhood character that could mask bias, creating transparent processes for reporting security concerns that required specific behaviors rather than vague suspicions. These revisions maintain our community's commitment to safety and property values, she concluded, while ensuring that those values are not used as cover for exclusionary practices. I'm not asking to keep my position on the board. I'm asking that these changes be considered and implemented regardless of who fills this seat. The presentation created a palpable shift in the room's energy. Those who had come expecting either a dramatic resignation or a defensive stand found themselves instead witnessing something more complex, a flawed individual leveraging her privilege and procedural knowledge toward structural change. Walter Prescott removed his glasses, polishing them as he often did when buying time to think. This is quite comprehensive, Karen. The board will need time to review these proposals in detail. Of course, Karen agreed. I'm not asking for an immediate vote. I'm simply requesting that these revisions be given formal consideration before any decision is made regarding my position. If the community still wishes me to resign after that process is complete, I will do so without further objection. The strategic maneuver was impressive, neither completely conceding defeat nor stubbornly clinging to power, but instead redirecting attention to policy changes that would outlast any individual board member. It represented the most constructive application of Karen's organizational skills and knowledge of HOA procedures, channeled now toward dismantling rather than enforcing problematic systems. As the meeting progressed, Officer Rivera, seated near the back of the room, observed with professional interest. His own department had begun implementing changes directly informed by the incident at the Johnson home. The mandatory training he had developed with his captain focused on response protocols for suspicious person calls, requiring dispatchers to obtain specific behavioral descriptions and officers to approach with decreased assumption of threat. Small changes, perhaps, but cumulative ones that might prevent similar incidents in the future. Marcus sat on the back porch with his mother, the summer evening settling around them as he described the Prestons' investment proposal. The business plan they had outlined was spread on the table between them, the glossy projections and expansion, timelines looking simultaneously appealing and somewhat alien compared to Marcus's own meticulously handwritten plans. On paper, it looks amazing, he admitted. The equipment upgrades alone would take me 2 years to save for otherwise, but something about it feels, he searched for the right word, colonizing. Like they're trying to take over something that's mine and make it theirs. Even with the best intentions, Diane nodded, understanding immediately what her son was struggling to articulate. There's a difference between support and appropriation, she said, between helping someone achieve their vision and reshaping it to match yours. Their conversation was interrupted by Emma Whitley appearing at their back gate, hesitating before calling out a greeting. Sorry to interrupt, she said, an uncharacteristic nervousness in her voice. I wanted to talk to Marcus about something. If this is a bad time, I can come back. It's fine, Marcus said, after exchanging a glance with his mother. Come on up. Emma joined them on the porch, clutching a folder that looked suspiciously like a presentation. I've been thinking a lot since the youth dialogue, she began, her words coming in a rush as if she'd rehearsed them, about how most of the conversations happening are among adults, making decisions that affect us without our input. She opened the folder, revealing a neatly organized proposal. Some of us want to start a youth advisory council for the neighborhood, not just talking about issues, but actually having input on decisions, organizing our own projects. And I thought you'd be the perfect person to co-lead it with me. The proposal caught Marcus by surprise. Unlike the Prestons' business investment, which had felt vaguely patronizing despite its generosity, Emma's approach was different, a genuine peer invitation that acknowledged his leadership without trying to shape or control it. Who's we? He asked, his natural caution still present but softened by curiosity. About 8 of us from the youth dialogue, plus a few others who heard about it after, Emma explained. We've got a mix of ages, backgrounds, different parts of the neighborhood, represented. Sadie helped us with the structure, but the ideas are ours. As Emma elaborated on the council's potential projects, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced much in recent weeks. Simple, uncomplicated interest. No trauma response, no performance pressure, just genuine engagement with an idea that spoke to his values. I'd need to balance it with my business commitments, he said finally. But yeah, I'm interested. Send me the details and we can set up a real meeting. After she had gone, Diane gave her son a thoughtful look. That's quite different from the Preston proposal. Yeah, Marcus agreed. It feels more like collaboration than charity, like we're building something together instead of them trying to help me. The contrast illuminated the crucial difference between genuine allyship and performative gestures. One centered Marcus's agency and voice, while the other, despite good intentions, reinforced existing power dynamics under the guise of support. As July gave way to August, Oakwood Heights settled into a new normal that was neither the comfortable denial of before nor the dramatic confrontation of recent weeks. Instead, the community existed in the messy middle space of actual change, awkward, imperfect, and occasionally regressive, yet persistently moving forward. Karen Whitley's proposed HOA revisions passed with modifications, though she ultimately stepped down from the board once the changes were implemented. Her resignation letter acknowledged the harm caused by her actions, while emphasizing her commitment to continued learning, a balance of accountability and forward movement that reflected genuine if incomplete growth. Marcus developed a counter-proposal for the Prestons, accepting limited equipment support in exchange for providing lawn care training to teenagers from underserved neighborhoods beyond Oakwood Heights. The revised arrangement maintained his agency, while expanding opportunity for others, a form of paying forward support rather than simply receiving it. The Youth Advisory Council took shape under Emma and Marcus's co-leadership, quickly demonstrating that the younger generation often navigated difficult conversations with more directness and less defensiveness than their parents. Their first project, documenting oral histories from longtime residents like George Harrington, created an unprecedented intergenerational dialogue about how the community had evolved. Diane continued hosting educational gatherings, but with increasingly firm boundaries around her time and emotional labor. When neighbors requested private coaching on racial issues, she redirected them to professional resources, protecting her family's well-being while still contributing to community growth in structured ways. Throughout these changes, the physical landscape of Oakwood Heights remained largely the same: manicured lawns, careful landscaping, properties maintained to high standards. But the invisible boundaries that had divided the community had been irrevocably altered, not erased but at least acknowledged, making space for new connections that would have been impossible months earlier. As summer began its gradual transition toward fall, plans emerged for the annual neighborhood block party traditionally held on Labor Day weekend. The event would serve as both a test and a celebration of the community's changed dynamics, a public gathering where residents would navigate their new relationships and understandings in real time. Whether the fragile progress of recent weeks would strengthen into lasting change or revert to comfortable patterns remained to be seen. But as the summer of confrontation and growth neared its conclusion, one thing was certain: Oakwood Heights could no longer pretend to be anything other than what it was, a community in transformation, grappling with its past while uncertainly creating its future, one uncomfortable conversation, one policy change, one genuine connection at a time. The wooden planning table in the Oakwood Heights Community Center was scattered with paper plates bearing half-eaten slices of 3 different cakes: chocolate from the bakery on Main Street, a homemade lemon pound cake, and a bright green Filipino pandan cake that Sadie Chen had brought from her favorite Asian market. The diversity of desserts had become an unintentional but fitting metaphor for the Block Party Planning Committee's new approach. "So we're agreed on the food then?" asked Sadie, checking items off her meticulous planning list. Traditional grilling station plus the international potluck tables, with clear labeling for dietary restrictions. Karen Whitley nodded, making her own notes. Though no longer on the HOA board, she had volunteered for the planning committee, channeling her organizational skills toward community building rather than community policing. "I've confirmed the rental company for tables and chairs. They'll deliver Friday afternoon. And the music schedule looks good," added Diane Johnson, reviewing the entertainment lineup that intentionally featured performers from different cultural backgrounds, ages, and musical styles. The high school jazz band, Mr. Harrington's barbershop quartet, DJ Miguel for dancing, and the Vietnamese dance group from the community college. The three women formed an unlikely leadership trio, their collaboration born not from natural affinity, but from deliberate choice to model the integration they hoped to foster in the wider neighborhood. Their planning meetings had evolved from initially awkward exchanges to a functional working relationship built on grudging mutual respect. "What about the garage door project?" Karen asked, glancing toward Diane with the careful neutrality that characterized their interactions. "Is everything set for the unveiling?" "Yes," Diane confirmed. "The local artist finished the design work last week, and the youth team will complete the installation by Saturday morning. Marcus has been coordinating their schedule around his lawn service commitments." The mention of her son's business prompted a small smile. In the week since declining the Prestons' full investment proposal, Marcus had developed his own expansion model, hiring and training younger teens from both Oakwood Heights and surrounding neighborhoods, with a focus on providing affordable services to elderly residents who couldn't maintain their properties independently. What had begun as a one-person summer job had evolved into a small enterprise that combined entrepreneurship with community service. "Speaking of which," Sadie interjected, checking her watch, "we should wrap up soon. Marcus is bringing his crew to do final cleanup of the park area at 4, and I promised to meet them with cold drinks and snacks." As the women gathered their materials, there was a moment of quiet acknowledgement that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Three individuals from vastly different perspectives finding common purpose in creating something new from the fragments of community breakdown. Not friends, perhaps, but collaborators in the difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding. The morning of the block party dawned clear and bright, the late summer heat tempered by a gentle breeze that rustled through the oak trees, lining the neighborhood's central park. By 9 o'clock, volunteers were already setting up tables and canopies, stringing lights between trees, and arranging activity stations throughout the space. Marcus directed his lawn service team, now expanded to include 5 younger teens wearing matching green shirts with "Johnson Community Lawn Care" printed across the back in final preparations of the grounds. The pride in his posture was evident as he demonstrated proper techniques for string trimmer use to 14-year-old Darius, a quiet but attentive apprentice from the adjacent neighborhood. "Remember, steady hands and consistent distance," Marcus instructed, guiding Darius's movements with the patience of a natural teacher. "You're creating a clean edge, not just cutting grass." Nearby, Emma Whitley supervised the Youth Advisory Council's contribution to the festivities, a historical timeline exhibit featuring photographs, documents, and oral histories collected from long-term residents. The project, initially George Harrington's idea but expanded through Emma and Marcus's collaboration, traced the neighborhood's evolution over 4 decades, including honest acknowledgement of its exclusionary past alongside hopes for its more inclusive future. "The frames should be evenly spaced," Emma directed 2 council members who were hanging display panels. "We want people to be able to follow the chronology clearly." Her organizational precision mirrored her mother's, though directed toward transparency rather than control, an inheritance transformed rather than rejected. Across the park, Karen Whitley was overseeing the setup of the welcome table, carefully arranging name tags, community resource pamphlets, and block party programs. She wore a simple blue dress rather than her once signature tailored blazers, her appearance reflecting the subtle shifts in her self-perception over the summer months. "Mom," Emma called, approaching with a folder in hand. "We need your sign-off on the final schedule before we print the QR code signs." Their relationship had gradually thawed following the community dialogue, though Emma's independent stance remained firm. The Youth Advisory Council had become her primary focus, providing space to develop her own identity separate from family dynamics while still allowing for collaborative interactions with her mother on specific projects. "Everything looks good," Karen confirmed after reviewing the document. She hesitated, then added, "Your historical exhibit is impressive, Emma, especially the integration of George's records with the oral histories. It can't have been easy to present some of those uncomfortable truths." "That was actually Marcus's insistence," Emma replied. "He said there's no point in acknowledging history if we sanitize it. The whole truth or nothing." A note of admiration colored her voice, though, whether for the principle or its advocate remained ambiguous. Karen nodded, recognizing both the implied criticism of past community approaches and the validity of the perspective. "He's right," she acknowledged simply. "Uncomfortable truths are still truths." The brief exchange represented their new normal. Moments of genuine connection interspersed with the ongoing navigation of different worldviews. Not perfect reconciliation, but the beginning of mutual respect that allowed space for both agreement and difference. By noon, the block party was in full swing. The Central Park had transformed into a vibrant community space with multiple activity centers, food stations featuring diverse offerings, and clusters of neighbors engaged in conversations that crossed previously rigid social boundaries. Officer James Rivera arrived in civilian clothes, his young daughter perched on his shoulders, his wife carrying a homemade tres leches cake toward the dessert table. His dual identity as both law enforcement and community member no longer felt as contradictory as it once had. The summer's events had forced a reckoning within the department that, while far from complete, had created space for more nuanced relationship between police and the neighborhoods they served. Officer Rivera called Marcus, waving from near the grilling station where he was taking a break with his lawn crew. "Brought your appetite, I hope. Mr. Wilson's been experimenting with different barbecue styles." Rivera approached, lifting his daughter down to run toward the children's activity area supervised by volunteer parents. "Just James today," he reminded Marcus with a smile. "And yes, definitely hungry. How's business going?" The casual interaction between them, neither strained nor artificially friendly, represented countless similar exchanges happening throughout the gathering. Residents who had found themselves on opposite sides of community conflict now navigated new connections, not by pretending the summer's tensions hadn't occurred, but by acknowledging them and cautiously building new patterns of engagement. Narni. The historical exhibit, George Harrington had drawn an attentive audience as he pointed out details in old photographs, his narrative offering context that the printed materials alone couldn't convey. "This was 1985, he explained, indicating an aerial view of the neighborhood. "See how the eastern section hadn't been developed yet? That came later, when they expanded the school district boundaries. That's when things started changing demographically, though very slowly at first." His honesty about the community's evolution had become his contribution to neighborhood healing, not defending or glorifying the past, but illuminating it with the insight of someone who had lived through multiple eras of change. At 82, he had discovered an unexpected purpose as community historian and mentor to the Youth Advisory Council, roles that gave meaning to his later years beyond his original identity as original homeowner. Throughout the afternoon, the block party ebbed and flowed with the natural rhythm of community gatherings. Children raced between activity stations, teenagers clustered in shifting social groups, adults moved between food tables and conversation circles. The atmosphere wasn't one of forced harmony or exaggerated inclusivity, but rather of a community and honest process, acknowledging differences while finding points of genuine connection. Not everything unfolded perfectly. At the international food table, an older resident made a loudly inappropriate comment about weird-smelling foreign food that created a moment of tension. But unlike previous community dynamics where such remarks might have been awkwardly ignored, a nearby neighbor addressed it directly. That comment was unnecessary and hurtful. "These dishes represent our neighbor's cultural heritage, and they've generously shared them with us." The brief confrontation didn't escalate or derail the festivities, but neither was it swept under the rug. The small incident and its handling demonstrated the community's halting progress toward new patterns, not complete transformation, but incremental steps toward more honest engagement with both conflict and connection. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Sadie Chen's voice came over the portable sound system. "If everyone could gather near the Johnson residence in 15 minutes, we'll be unveiling the community art project. Bring your drinks and plates, this is a casual gathering." The announcement prompted a gradual migration from the park toward the blue colonial house that had become the unexpected epicenter of neighborhood transformation. The garage door, site of hateful vandalism just weeks earlier, had been covered with a large tarp, concealing the collaborative art project beneath. Marcus stood with his mother on their front lawn, watching as neighbors assembled in a loose semicircle facing their home. The moment held complex emotions for both of them. Pride and community resilience mixed with the unavoidable memory of violation, appreciation for collective response tempered by awareness that the need for response had come from hatred directed specifically at them. "You doing okay with this?" Diane asked quietly, noticing the subtle tension in her son's posture. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than performatively positive. "Yeah, it's weird, but in a good way. Transforming something ugly into something meaningful." He paused, then added with unexpected lightness, "Plus, the mural design is actually pretty amazing." Sadie approached them, clipboard predictably in hand despite the festive occasion. "We're ready whenever you are," she said. "We thought you might want to do the unveiling, but no pressure if that feels uncomfortable." The consideration reflected Sadie's growth as a community organizer, learning to balance her driving efficiency with sensitivity to the complex emotions of those most directly affected by community issues. Her own experiences with exclusion had made her a powerful advocate, but the summer's events had taught her to temper urgency with patience, to distinguish between performative gestures and meaningful change. After a brief consultation, Marcus and Diane moved to stand beside the covered garage door. The gathered crowd quieted as Diane spoke. "A few months ago, our property was vandalized with hateful messages," she began, her voice carrying the measured strength that had guided her through both legal battles and personal challenges. "That act was meant to tell our family that we didn't belong here. Today we're unveiling a different message, one created collaboratively by neighbors of all ages and backgrounds." She gestured to Marcus, who gripped the edge of the tarp. "This isn't about erasing what happened, but about transforming it into something that honestly acknowledges both our community's past and our hopes for its future." Marcus pulled the covering away in one smooth motion, revealing the mural beneath. The design incorporated elements of Oakwood Heights' physical landscape, the distinctive oak trees, the curved streets, the architectural features of various homes, but rendered them in a style that integrated diverse cultural aesthetics. Interwoven throughout were symbols of community connection, historical references both comfortable and challenging, and subtle representations of the neighborhood's evolution. Most striking was the central image, diverse hands of different ages, sizes and skin tones working together to build a structure, the foundation stones bearing words like truth, justice, belonging, and growth. Above this scene, a simple phrase arched in flowing script: "A community is always under construction." A murmur of appreciation moved through the gathered neighbors as they absorbed the artwork's details and symbolism. The mural wasn't a saccharine image of perfect harmony, but rather an honest depiction of the ongoing, imperfect work of building genuine community across differences. The young artist who had designed the piece, a graduate student from the nearby university, stepped forward to explain specific elements and acknowledge the contributions of youth advisory council members who had participated in the painting process. As she spoke, Marcus found himself studying the reactions of various neighbors, George Harrington nodding with appreciation at the historical accuracy, Karen Whitley listening with genuine interest rather than defensive discomfort, Officer Rivera pointing out details to his daughter with quiet explanations. There was no dramatic moment of collective catharsis, no perfect resolution that tied the community's journey into a neat conclusion. Instead, there was something more authentic, a shared recognition of both progress made and distance yet to travel, of relationships slowly rebuilding on more honest foundations. Skagakodi. As evening settled over Oakwood Heights, the block party gradually wound down. Families with young children departed first, followed by elderly residents like George Harrington, who left with promises to return for the Youth Council's next oral history session. Volunteers worked in comfortable tandem to clean up, their collaborative efforts a fitting coda to the day's activities. Near the dessert table, now reduced to a few remaining slices, Diane found herself in an unexpected conversation with Karen, their first extended one-on-one exchange since the community dialogue weeks earlier. The party was a success, Karen offered, helping to pack leftover napkins and serving utensils. Very different from previous years, but in a good way. Diane nodded agreement. More authentic, I think. Less concern with perfect appearances, more focus on genuine connection. A brief silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken history. Finally, Karen spoke with careful directness. I want you to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything that happened this summer, about my role in it. I don't expect forgiveness or friendship, but I hope you can see that I'm committed to doing better. Diane studied her, measuring the sincerity of the statement. I can acknowledge that, she said finally. And I respect the work you did on revising the HOA policies. That will have lasting impact beyond personal apologies. It wasn't warm reconciliation, but it was honest recognition. Two women acknowledging each other's humanity while maintaining appropriate boundaries shaped by their experiences. Not all harm could or should be erased by good intentions or subsequent growth, but neither did past mistakes necessarily preclude future positive contribution. Across the park, Marcus and Emma sat on a bench near the historical timeline exhibit, comparing notes on the day's events. Your lawn crew did good work, Emma commented. Darius seems really dedicated. Marcus nodded. He reminds me of myself, at that age, serious about doing things right. The others tease him about it, but he doesn't let it bother him. Their conversation drifted to plans for the Youth Advisory Council's fall projects, their collaborative leadership having created an unexpected alliance between them. Not quite friendship, not romance, but a connection based on shared purpose and mutual respect that had grown from the summer's crucible of community conflict. School starts Monday, Emma observed, the simple statement acknowledgement that their summer of transformation was drawing to a close. Everything's going to change again. Some things will, Marcus agreed, but not everything. He gestured toward the mural visible in the distance, illuminated by the soft glow of porch lights. Some changes stick. As twilight deepened into evening, the last participants dispersed to their homes throughout Oakwood Heights. The physical evidence of the block party would be gone by morning, tables folded away, decorations removed, grass showing only minimal evidence of hundreds of footsteps. But the less tangible impacts would remain, shifting relationships, evolving expectations, new patterns of interaction still tentative but genuinely rooted. The neighborhood itself appeared largely unchanged, the same houses with their manicured lawns, the same curving streets lined with mature oak trees, the same careful attention to aesthetic details. But beneath this familiar surface, the invisible geography of community had been irrevocably altered. Boundaries had been questioned, histories acknowledged, assumptions challenged. The work was far from complete. Genuine transformation never arrived in a single season, but foundations had been laid for something more authentic to continue growing. As Marcus closed the front door behind him at the end of the long day, he paused to look once more at the mural that had transformed their garage from a site of trauma to a symbol of possibility. The summer that had begun with his careful planning of lawn mowing routes had evolved into something far more complex and significant than he could have anticipated. His business had grown, his understanding of community had deepened, and his sense of both caution and possibility had expanded. Tomorrow he would mow Mrs. Patel's lawn before she returned from visiting her daughter. Next week, he would balance school responsibilities with his lawn service schedule. Life would continue, its forward momentum, but something fundamental had shifted, in himself, in his family, in the neighborhood they called home. Not perfect transformation, but meaningful change. Not final resolution, but new foundations upon which to continue building. Outside, the summer crickets sang their evening chorus, the familiar soundtrack of suburban nights creating continuity between what had been and what was still becoming. Oakwood Heights settled into darkness, its residents carrying forward both the weight of honest reckonings and the tentative hope of more authentic connections, a community perpetually under construction, imperfect, but genuinely evolving. Up Next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.